If you happen to watch my lore video for Jack Krauser, then it may or may not be apparent to you that the RE4 remake makes some changes to what exactly he was doing, linking up with Sadler and the Los Illuminados. In the original game from 2005, he had infiltrated the cult as a third party working on behalf of Wesker to retrieve a dominant species plaga. In the remake, however, he has no real affiliation with Wesker, and he's completely with the cult because he wants the power of Las Plagas to himself after a tragic event in South America. Now, while that's interesting enough on its own, that's not where the confusing part of Krauser's backstory comes from. The changes to his motivation are pretty well spelled out for us, and if you read the documents, you can get a fairly clear picture of who he is in the remake and what he wants. The main point of contention for me with Krauser revolves around a blink and you miss it line of dialogue that he says during his final conflicts with Leon.
You remember the fight in the jungle? We barely made it out alive.
Go with your gut, don't think. That was the first thing you taught me.
If you're familiar with the massive compendium of Resident Evil lore, then this line likely draws your mind to an event that happened in Resident Evil Darkside Chronicles, wherein Krauser and Leon team up to find an Umbrella-associated bioweapons dealer that was supposedly selling to a warlord down in South America. In the original game, this is what seemed to serve for the setup of their relationship, but in the remake, it's a bit more complex. You see, Darkside Chronicles is loosely canonical. Events within that game often happened, but are twisted to fit the narrative of that game rather than be canonical to the events of the mainline series. For example, Darkside covers Code Veronica, but instead of Alfred dying to blood loss after a fight with Claire and Steve, he's instead killed by Alexia. For me, I've mostly used Darkside to fill in gaps that kind of expand the stories of some characters, but the actual mainline game takes priority over what I would consider canonical to the continuing series. However, for Krauser and Leon's portion of that game, it's entirely a new storyline that's untouched by any other title. So what transpired during their mission would typically be considered wholly canonical because in the original game, it's the only connection that we have for them. So already in the 2005 version of the game, the separation between Darkside and Resident Evil 4 made Krauser a difficult character to fully grasp. And then we get into the remake. In the remake, Krauser is given a backstory as it pertains to his association with Leon and his association with the cult. His association with Leon derives from him being his trainer in close quarters combat, as we can see at the very beginning of the game. His association with the cult deriving from a mission in South America where the US left his team stranded and they all perished in combat with drug cartels, aside from Krauser himself. Now, this is all well and good. Krauser's backstory changes a little from the original game to the remake, and it's a change that I personally think makes sense. But then they have to throw in this line.
You remember the fight in the jungle? We barely made it out alive.
Go with your gut, don't think. That was the first thing you taught me.
This line is confusing because the specifics of what they're talking about aren't elaborated upon, but it would be assumed that they're referring to Operation Javier. But Operation Javier is also the mission to be assumed that Krauser's entire team died and he was abandoned by the US in some capacity, so what are they referring to? We're led to assume that Leon wasn't on the mission where Krauser lost all his men because the report makes no mention of him and also says that they were entirely wiped out. So then your assumptions have to turn to, okay, Leon and Krauser had Operation Javier, and then Krauser got called in for another mission where he lost all his men. The only issue with that being that the name of the report in Krauser's tent detailing the events says that this was Operation Javier. So then we have to assume that they went on another mission together that we are given no context for before Krauser got pulled into the mission where he lost all his men. In all likelihood, this is probably just some kind of Easter egg line for people who are familiar with Darkside Chronicles, and it's not meant to be taken all that seriously. But if you're some kind of dweeb who tries to pay close attention to the lore, not that I know anyone like that, then this line doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Unless, of course, you're telling me that Leon was part of Operation Javier and the report was wrong. Then, when Leon arrived on the scene and saw his entire troop die all around him, didn't faze him much. Then, when the US abandoned him to die, he was undeterred and kept working for them. Then, when his former commanding officer went insane after the tragedy, he just left him to it. I don't know, possible I suppose, but seems like a bit of a dick move.